Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Film Haven Reviews. I'm your host Sawyer as always, and today we have a very special episode. Of course, it is our 100th episode. So we've made it. I wish I had some kind of like pomp and circumstances play overlay. Maybe I'll do that in post. But yeah, we did it. We have made it to 100 episodes. Thank you to everybody who has joined me throughout this whole thing. I feel like there's always this like milestone, so I feel like I'm always being like, thank you for everybody who's stuck with me this whole journey and all that kind of stuff. I guess because I'm doing video now, and so I'm kind of being a little, I don't know, not nostalgic, but feeling reflective a little bit on just kind of like the journey that I've been on since I started the podcast. I mean, 100 episodes, that's no joke, man. I kind of did the math there. I think we're now going into our 34th theme. If you do that right, 99 divided by 3, right? Because everything's in themes of 3. So that's not including, of course, all the special episodes. If you add all those, we're at like 107 or 8. But I'm talking regular thematic episodes. We are at 100, which means we are on the 100th Friday of the podcast because I have not missed a Friday for almost 2 years. I think it'll be the last Friday in March, first Friday in April. One of those, it will be the actual 2-year mark. And so I guess at that point we'll have another congratulations or whatever, celebration. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time because last episode was like 45 minutes and I want to try to cut that down to 30 if I can. Now that I'm kind of being a little bit more structured and stuff, it kind of is a double-edged sword. So on one end, I'm making sure that I talk about everything. I'm being a little bit more concise about the information that I am giving. But on another end, there's more information that I can cram in because I'm being more organized about it. I'm not forgetting anything, which means that I'm adding stuff that I maybe would forget in a normal episode that would maybe last 20 minutes. And now, of course, last week lasted 45. So without further ado, let's get into it. Thanks for everyone who's been coming on to the that's been, tuning into the podcast, and I appreciate your support. And of course, just real fast, I should probably be doing this every episode, but if you want to watch this episode on video, which how it's been for the last like 4 episodes now, and you don't have Spotify, because you should be able to watch it on Spotify, but if you don't, if you're listening to it on some other podcast apps and stuff like that, go follow me on YouTube. Just type in Film Haven Reviews on YouTube. Subscribe to me. All these videos will be up here, as well as some shorts and stuff like that, some reels. So yeah, we're trying to push this forward in a more visual format. And as you'll see with last episode, Night of the Living Dead especially, and then this one too, it really helps to watch it video because you get to see what I'm talking about. I'm going to be overlaying scenes, and whenever I talk about a character, you're going to see their face and like all that kind of stuff. And so it really, especially with this movie that we're going to be talking about, there are so many different characters to get into that it's going to be hard. It might be hard to keep up when I'm just doing it on audio, which is kind of like when I was doing Akira a couple weeks ago. Like that was so hard to try to convey the visualization of the movie because the story is so crazy and then the things I'm describing are crazy. And so I feel like if you're just listening to it, it might be really hard to kind of follow along and keep up. And I want this podcast to be accessible. I want people to enjoy it. And I want them to follow along and not just kind of, I know when someone's just talking for 30, 40 minutes, you can kind of drone off and all that kind of stuff. But I would love to keep you engaged if that makes sense. So anyway, I will digress from there. Let's get into the movie because there is tons to talk about. This is a very loaded film. It is called The Wild Bunch from 1969. Let's get that poster up here. So yes, there's once again, trying to get not talk too much about this, but there is a whole story for why I'm doing this movie now. I thought about it again because I mentioned it last week with Night of the Living Dead. And this has probably been the most like considered movie for me to review since I started the Instagram like 5 years ago. I keep thinking, okay, I'm going to do the Wild Bunch now. And I never do it. I learned about it in film school. They talked a lot about it, especially because of the violence and the bloodiness and the amount of, so those blood packs. I keep calling them packs, but they're called squibs, blood squibs. But I think people will it may make more sense if you think of them as blood packs of blood that are put in people's clothes, and you activate them and they burst out and it makes it look like they just got shot. And so this movie, I don't think it necessarily pioneered the use of them, but it definitely normalized them in a way and used them to such indulgence that people paid attention to the violence and to the blood in this film. Especially since this movie isn't a horror film, it is in a way, especially for the time, because it was so violent. I think a lot of people watching this at the time were so shocked by the violence and the blood that you could consider you could say they were horrified. But the squibs and the use of that blood technology and practical effects will definitely translate immediately to the horror genre. And I really want to do like a deep dive on squibs. I was thinking I could even do like a whole episode maybe where we just talk about the kind of blood in film, which I think is really interesting. I'll be thinking about that. But anyway, that's what this movie is really known for. And then also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this movie is because my cousin's in it. Technically, he's my third cousin, Warren Oates. He's one of the Wild Bunch, one of the final four in the film. And he's been in a lot of movies. Anyone who's over the age of like 50 probably knows who he is, but people under 50 probably don't. I wouldn't have known who he was if I wasn't a big movie guy, and I also wasn't related to him. My grandmother was first cousins with Warren Oates, so they grew up together actually. So they were pretty close. So it's not really that far of a degree of separation, but it is always fun for me to watch movies with him because I'm like, hey, my grandmother is like really close to him, and he's technically my blood. So that's kind of fun. So that's another reason why I wanted to do the movie, is because there's kind of like a familial connection a little bit. And this is probably his most famous role, one of them. Definitely one of the best movies that he's been in. If we just look at the IMDb, it's a 7.9 user and then a 98 Metascore. That is very high, like extremely high, almost 100, which is pretty insane. I think one of the only movies that we've done that has been 100 was Notorious, which was at 100, which I thought was pretty overrated, but still a good movie, but overrated. This one I wouldn't go as high as to say 98. So we'll just go right into it, actually. Let's get into the overview. I'm going to try to keep this one short and sweet. I feel like I went a little long last episode on the overview, but so I'm going to give it 8 out of 10, which is pretty good. I was 8 out of 10s in a row, which is kind of fun. But it's just how it's working, especially with last week and this week. We're doing movies with a lot of precedence, movies that were very influential. I was reading an article that we'll mention later, and talking about how Walter Hill, funny enough, his movie, The Lone Rangers or something like that, the Lone Riders, I think is what it is, from 1980. That movie very much completely copied an entire scene from this film. So once again, we got a little Walter Hill shout out there, which is kind of fun because we just did that theme. But yeah, so this movie is very influential, very precedential. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's getting elevated a little bit. The best way to describe this movie, I can kind of put it into 3 categories. The first thing is peaks and valleys. So the movie is like starts off with a bang, has a long drawn out exposition, and then boom, there's a bang in the middle, and then a little bit more it's a little more fun in that latter third. But then like the last 5 minutes, the big action scene that we'll talk about later is just so good that you can't give this anything lower than an 8. Like if you care about action, if you care about Western action, if you care about shootouts and stuff like that, I mean, other than it doesn't even compare to say like Django Unchained, the big gunfight in the plantation. That one's really crazy. It is for sure. But if anything, it's an homage to this one with just how much gore and carnage it is in one scene. And we'll get into it because there's a whole article that talks a lot about just the 5 minutes of that action scene, which I always think is really fun. We'll get into it, but I just love the idea that how much a filmmaker will go through, how much shooting, how much stuff just for 5 minutes on the reel. I just always find that really fascinating. It just kind of shows you what goes into a movie and how sometimes there are things that are phoned in, but a lot of times there is so much more going on than you realize. And that's one of the things I like to kind of point out in the podcast is to kind of talk about what, like, if I can talk about practical effects and stuff like that, set design, costume design, all that kind of stuff really gives you a better appreciation for the movie that you're watching. So it's not just fun fair popcorn films. A lot of times, even the popcorn films have so much going into them. The Wild Bunch being a very good example of 5 minutes that took weeks to or at least a week, I think, of just straight shooting with so much coordination. The team behind that scene, filming that scene, is just very impressive. Anyway, so another thing is, speaking of which, of the 3 things in this overview would be the great sets, the environment, the practical effects. For shooting outdoors, I mean, a lot of westerns are going to do that, but for shooting outdoors, there's a lot of really beautiful scenes. You're in sand dunes, you're in South Texas, and then you're also in Mexico a lot. Most of the movies in Mexico. And then the settings as well. You've got everything from the South Texas town with this beautiful kind of long street that almost looks like your typical Western street, but it has a little bit of like a Southern, almost like Louisiana flair with these trees that are kind of lining the railroad as you come, as the Wild Bunch is first coming down in the opening sequence down the street. Then you've got the Mexican village. There's this really nice, authentic Mexican village, and you get to see all that. There's like these kids jumping around in the pond, and everybody kind of hanging out, and just really cool aesthetic. And then, of course, there's Agua Verde, which is like the big city, kind of more like a fort town that the general lives at, that we'll get into his character in a little bit. All three of those sets, like in particular, are just really well done, and it feels very authentic. And apparently the director, Sam Peckinpah, has had a love affair with Mexico. So he really loved Mexico, which makes sense. You could tell that there was there were pains taken in order to make everything feel authentic. And then really the third thing about the overview, the thing that really kind of you notice about at least halfway through, if not earlier, is that the movie is epic. I would say towards the latter half, you definitely get that sense of like, oh my God, there's a lot of players in this movie. There's some different stakes. Pretty much everyone's getting involved. This little Wild Bunch seems like they're almost, a part of international relations between America and Mexico and the revolutionaries. And it's just like, whoa, they're kind of gotten themselves mixed up in a whole lot of kind of macro politics, geopolitics, which is really interesting. And so, speaking of the different characters, the different players in this film, let's get into the plot, because I really feel like in order to talk about this movie, I'm going to have to kind of break down some of the characters and some of the factions, because there are a lot. So the narrative structure is actually pretty simple. It's just like basically one last job, and then the job kind of goes awry, and that's the movie. But the factions that are involved, there's so many of them that it really kind of needs you to break them down a little bit. So let's do that. So first faction, of course, the titular, the Wild Bunch, led by Pike, who's played by William Holden, very famous actor. You know him from Sunset Boulevard or Stalag 17. There's so many. He's one of those legacy actors from back in the day. And so the Wild Bunch is this long-running outlaw gang. Pike has been leading them for a long time, and Pike is getting too old for this. It's very classic. And so this opening sequence is of them doing this bank job, and it doesn't go well. And so now they have to take another job. And he was like, that was supposed to be our last job, and now we got one more job to do. And so that's pretty much the Wild Bunch right there. They're getting too old for it. They're going to go on one last ride to try to make their money and then ride off into the sunset. And then you've got a group of bounty hunters led by a guy named Thornton, who is sent by the railroad tycoon Harrigan to go after the Wild Bunch, because they're obviously spending a lot of his money. They're stealing his money, and so he's sending Thornton out. But the thing is, Thornton used to be part of the Wild Bunch, but he got caught and he went to jail, and they tortured him there. And so he wants now to go after the Wild Bunch, because one, he said he was going to do it, and two, he doesn't want to go to jail. And so that's kind of a fun little dynamic there. Like throughout this whole entire movie, you've got Thornton just kind of on their heels all the time while they're trying to do what they do. Third faction we got is the Mexican revolutionaries, or I would say it's just basically a group of different rebels who are fighting against the status quo. I looked this up because I was like, I wish I knew more about the Mexican Revolution, but it did take place between 1910 and 1920. This movie takes place in 1913, so it's right in the middle. And so you can definitely see throughout the movie that they're playing on the tensions between like regular people in Mexican villages, as well as the Native American population in the mountains. And those different bands are kind of forming their own faction, fighting against the military occupation, the dictatorship that was ruling Mexico at the time. Speaking of which, the next faction is the Mexican military. This is led by General Apache, who is very much a critical character in this movie, very kind of funny sometimes, but his big thing is he's very authoritarian, and he's also like capriciously dangerous, which I think is particularly a bad combination. When someone's got so much power that they'll laugh one minute and then shoot you in the next, he's definitely got that vibe, just way too much power. Actually, I didn't know where I was going to fit this in, but I loved this scene in the movie. It's towards like the second third, but they're literally being attacked by artillery and Mexican revolutionaries. And he's got like a mariachi band playing on the train while he's like ordering people to fight and stuff like that. And it's just like you could just tell this guy's almost like drunk with madness and authoritarianism. Like he just like on one level he's having fun and fiesta, and on another level he's fighting people and ordering deaths and all that kind of stuff. And I just felt like that was like such a stark little, it's kind of funny. Like it definitely meant to be, but also a really epic scene. It's just kind of like a throwaway scene of sorts. Like it doesn't last too long and it's not any of the big set pieces, but like they're literally fighting this huge battle where there's artillery on the hill and they're on the mountains and they're shooting down into the valley. And it's just crazy. But anyway, that just kind of gives you an idea of General Mapache. He'll definitely come back in more in our discussion. And our last faction is the American military, which is basically just there. It does not really use very much. It's just in one scene where the Wild Bunch has to steal a bunch of rifles and ammunition from a train, and the Americans are running the train. And so that's really all you see of the American military. But they do play a bit of a ghost part in the film, because one of the reason why the Wild Bunch is even being tasked by General Mapache to go get those arms is because he doesn't want to get them himself. He needs the arms and ammunition, but he doesn't want to get them himself because he's trying to ingratiate himself with the American military and with the American government. And so he doesn't want to stick it to them, but he wants to stick it to them, if that makes sense. And so he's going to send this outlaw group to go do it for him. And that way he'll have, best of both worlds. He gets the ammunitions, but he doesn't hurt international relations. So now that we have gotten all those various factions put together, let's actually put them together in a narrative way. And I'll just try to describe to you what the actual narrative of this film is so that we can kind of move forward from there. So you guys will kind of be oriented for when I'm talking about the specifics. Okay, so the Wild Bunch is recruited by the General Mapache to steal rifles and arms from the American military so he can fight the revolutionary rebels. Meanwhile, the rail tycoon Harrigan has Thornton and his bounty hunter crew chasing after the Wild Bunch to finally end their reign as an expert bank robbing outlaw group. And finally, Angel, a new recruit from the Wild Bunch, has personal ties to the rebels and misbehaves in the presence of the general, shooting his ex-fiancée in front of him, which is a wild scene, and starts a thread of bad blood, which serves to be everyone's demise. So this Angel character, that's how the Mexican revolutionaries really kind of come in. He's like one of the newer recruits of the Wild Bunch, and he has a bad moment, right, where he shoots his ex-fiance who has gone over to the general side and is now her mistress. And so he shoots her in cold blood right next to the general. And that just kind of cascades later into, it really is more representative of the tensions between Mexican villages and the authoritarian military who are exploiting them. I mean, they're taking their women and they're giving them promises of luxury and stuff like that, and security, really, in exchange for sexual favors. So, it's not great. And there's obviously a lot more politics to go with that. But you can see like this personal kind of vendetta between Angel and General Mapache is, maybe you can blow it up into the greater issues between the Mexican villagers and the Native Americans in the mountains and the military regime. So yeah, that's the story. So we did pretty good. We're almost at 20 minutes or so. And now let's get into what I really wanted to talk about. So the best way to talk about this film is to really break down the three big scenes. Like I talked about before, it's peaks and valleys. So we don't really have to get into all the minutia about the kind of stuff in between, because what you're really here for in this movie, you're here for the action. You're here for those big moments. And that's what this movie is known for as well. If you get into the quiet parts, there's definitely stuff to get into, but a lot of it is just the Wild Bunch just being wild. And, they're not great guys. They're kind of living that outlaw life. And so I think that's a big kind of theme throughout the movie, which is like, they're not great, but they're not as bad as a military dictatorship. And they're also kind of embodiment of the Old West. And since this is taking place in 1913, you're seeing that their way of living is going away. And that's kind of a subtle theme throughout the movie, as you see an automobile for the first time. And then they get a machine gun that's used, that you would see in a World War I trenches. And so you've got this mounted machine gun. All this modernity is just being forced upon them. And even the people that are catching them are getting smart. That original robbery goes wrong because it was a plant. They kind of forced them to come there. They lured them in, and then there wasn't even real money in there. It was just an ambush, which we're about to get into. So everything about that outlaw way of living that the Wild Bunch has been doing, led by Pike, has now been is going away. It's dissolving, and so that's what the movie is about. But anyway, so you can break these down into three big parts. The first is the opening sequence, which is just done so well. It starts off as the Wild Bunch, who are masquerading as soldiers, but you don't know that. American soldiers are kind of coming in through town. It's kind of introducing on the characters. Love that with the title credits where they do the freeze frame and it's like a art rendition of them with their name, the actor next to them. You got William Holden with Pike, and then you've got Ernest Borgnine as Dutch. And then as they're coming through, you see it really cool. Like I talked about, the setting was awesome in this scene where you got that one strip of downtown and you got the trees that are lining the railroad and the street. And it's really kind of, you got this temperist movement kind of going on. There's some kind of meeting within the Southern Texas Temperist Union. And then at this point, if you don't know, like I didn't know, you just think, oh, I guess they're soldiers. And then they go they become outlaws. I don't know. And so it even gets to the point where they get to the end of the road and they almost run into an old lady. And then Pike ends up kind of saying, oh, let me escort you into the bank. And we'll all go in together. And then as they get in, they reveal, of course, that they are going to be robbing that bank. I don't know if it's a bank or if it's a railroad station that has money. Maybe they were both one and the same back in the day. Because obviously the railroad guy has an issue with this. He's setting up an ambush, and that is the thing. Little does Pike know is that this whole thing has been set up, and Thornton and his bounty hunters are sitting up on the roof across the street, and they're waiting to ambush them. So as soon as they come out with the money, they're going to go guns a-blazing. They're going to massacre them in the streets. However, this is when it gets really interesting because that temperance union has now done with their sermon, and they're starting to march with a marching band through the street, going right through the corner of the street that this ambush is supposed to take place. And right when Pike and his men are going to be coming out of the bank. And so there's this tension, right, where they're like, do we leave? And the ambushers are like, do we shoot anyway? And then meanwhile, you got the marching band playing and it's really loud. And so this tension is building and building and building. And when they decide to come out, they come out guns blazing and there's crossfire. Absolute pandemonium ensues. People are getting shot. Bystanders are being blown away. You're starting to see that blood that's kind of this movie's famous for. There's even one great shot where the guy gets shot right through the back of the head. Like you see the bullet come out of the back of his head. And it's just crazy. I mean, everything is bad. Like nobody is safe. People are dropping on both sides and the bystanders are dying. There's nothing good is happening here. And but the Wild Bunch, they end up getting away, at least a core of them. They lose a lot of men, and then they leave one guy who's very crazy in the back. And that is really where you see the first kind of example of these blood squibs being used to great effect, because this guy's got a shotgun, like a trench gun, like a World War I trench gun. And as he's kind of messing, he's kind of crazy. He's a little kooky, and he's like messing with his hostages. He was totally okay with everybody leaving. He's like, yeah, I'll just stay behind and I'll take the hostages. We'll be fine, without thinking like, oh, I'm literally being left to my death. But he doesn't care, because when he does see people starting to close in on him, he just turns around and he starts firing. And even though he dies, he takes like 3 guys out with him with the shotgun, and you see their bodies like getting blown up. And it's like, this is 1969. Wow. Yeah. So great opening sequence. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it sets you off on the right kind of foot, saying like, okay, this movie is not taking any prisoners. This movie is real. It's raw. And it is, there are no heroes here, even though you could say the Wild Bunch are the heroes in the end. They're not really. Everyone's kind of, I think one of the things that Sam Peckinpah was trying to say, he's trying to go hyper realism and kind of being like, no one's innocent. And you could say no one's innocent, but you could also say no one's truly evil too. It's like really leaving that gray area, which I think is in some ways very much what reality is. So then we can kind of yada yada through the story a little bit. We kind of get some more exposition on the characters. Pike, Pike's getting too old for this. Thornton used to be in the group, and now he's hunting them, and now everything was rigged, so they didn't actually make any money off that score, even though half the bunch died. There's only like 6 of them left. And so now they're going off to this General Mapache to meet up with him. And basically that's when they get recruited to go do a train heist where they steal American arms and rifles and guns and ammunition to bring to Mapache, like we talked about. So that brings us to the next spot, which is about halfway through the movie, which is the train heist, this one's really cool too, it's funny because Thornton and his men are actually on the train and they don't even know it's being taken over, like literally until they disconnect the train car and they move on. They don't even know what's happening. But while the train is stopping to get water, that's when the Wild Bunch kind of takes over silently, taking over one train car at a time. They're holding guys up, and then at some point, of course, things go awry and they start having their shootouts. And once again, we see another great scene, just awesome, like carnage, and also just like great choreography. And it's just exciting. You're just like, what's going to happen? What's happening? They disconnect the train car, they move on, they move forward, and then they take the arms off, put it on a carriage. That's a great scene, but it continues on. It's actually a really long scene because it kind of transitions into another scene where Thornton and his men are now catching up to them. And as they're trying to leave and go away with this carriage with a wagon with all the ammunitions on it. And so there's this bridge, and so they wire the bridge up for explosives. So they try to get the wagon across the other way, and of course the wagon falls halfway in. One of the wheels fall into the bridge, and they're having to pick it up and try to move on before Thornton and his men can get there. Thornton's men are really dumb, by the way. They start shooting the American soldiers like out of confusion. I'm not sure. But by the time, of course, they make it to the bridge, they're shooting at the guys on the other side, and then boom, they light the switch and the bridge just goes up. And that shot is fascinating. I don't know how they did that because you can literally see Thornton and his men on horseback on the bridge as is exploding. And I'm like, how did they make that safe? I want to read an article just on that one shot because, and this kind of gets to when I say the practical effects, it's not just the blood squibs, it's not just that kind of bloodiness and the fighting, it's also this explosion. I mean, it's set design and its practical effects. They took this bridge, they exploded it with people on it, and I don't know. I mean, I'll show it on the podcast. I probably already overlaid it, but like if anyone knows, let me know because it seems like very dangerous, and I don't know how someone would do that. So then that is the train scene, kind of extended train scene, the bridge scene. Another just great example. This is what I talk about, peaks and valleys. So you have that opening sequence that's huge, chaos in the streets, it's wild, 3 different factions in a bloodbath basically, and then you kind of dip and exposition, and then boom, you've got this big train heist scene, and the bridge scene explodes and all that. And then you've got the one little reprieve with that scene that I was talking about where the artillery, there's like that big battle between the Mexican military and the rebels. That was actually pretty exciting. But then there's another just dip for a while. And then we get to the scene, the final scene. It's a very famous scene. It's insane. I mean, it's literally got its own name, like a colloquial name that is used by film scholars and things. And it's called the Battle of the Bloody Porch. And basically it's Pike and the Wild Bunch. They're down to 4 now with Warren Oates, my cousin, one of them. And it's 2 brothers, Warren Oates and his brother. And then it's Pike. And then, of course, which I wish I could spend more time on this, but Ernest Borgnine's character, Dutch, is just, he's great. He's like the perfect sidekick, the perfect number 2, loves the lifestyle, doesn't want to ever stop it. He even says something about that. And for those of you that don't know Ernest Borgnine, I've actually talked about him because he was the bad guy in my Trucker series in the movie Convoy. But also, a lot of you that are younger do recognize him, but only as one character, and that is Mermaid Man from Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy.
No nonsense, Barnacle Boy. We've got to keep up our strength for the fight against evil.
But yeah, so it's Pike, it's Dutch, and then it's the 2 brothers, and they have a chance to leave. They've delivered the arms. At this point, General Mapache has taken Angel and has been kind of torturing him. And there's been a little bit back and forth where the guys kind of want to save him, but they're in the middle of a military base. I mean, there's a battalion of Mexican soldiers here that would just blow them away as soon as they started, shooting or trying to force anything. So it's like our hands are tied. We did what we said we're going to do, Angel kind of brought it on himself by, siding with his Mexican villagers and the revolutionaries, and also shooting his ex-fiance right next to the to the general, which is true. But they think, he's part of the group. He's in the Wild Bunch. So in their weird moral code, they're like, we stood by him, and if we don't stand by him, then what are we, animals? Which is funny because they left that guy in the bank in the opening sequence and they had no problem with that. But anyway, everyone has multitudes. Everyone is a hypocrite, really, and that's just how it is. That's what it is to be human, is to be duplicitous, and that's just true. But anyway, so they've decided to stake it here. So at one point, Pike is really doing this thinking, and he says to Warren Oates, actually, he says, "Let's go." And Warren Oates says, "All right, let's do it." And so this is when I just love this scene so much. So they come out, they're kind of in like a brothel situation. They come out, Pike grabs his shotgun and everyone's grabbing their guns, and they just kind of walk towards the general, who's on this porch in this kind of weird little small little amphitheater kind of get together area. They're having a fiesta, but that walk up is really like very famous. I could tell because it's iconic because it's just them four walking up. I got that like Seven Samurai, Magnificent Seven kind of vibe where these are our guys. This is the Wild Bunch, and they're walking down to their last stand. And very truly, honestly and truly, this is their last stand metaphorically as well. It's kind of like they are sticking their nose up, or they're going down in a blaze of glory against modernity, against the modern times, against the death of the old West. And they're saying our time is over. And if we're going to go out, there's only one way that we can go out. And that's with a hail of bullets. And so when they go up to the general, they have one last thing to say to him, give us Angel. They're going to say, like, we're going to take a stand, which is, it's weird. I think, once again, it's like kind of like, look, if we're going to die, we may not be good men, but we're better than that guy. So we're going to at least try to get our guy back and do something good before we die. And if he says no, then we're going to blow this place to smithereens. And of course, the general, this is where it all starts. The general says, "Oh, yeah, I'll give you Angel back." So he takes Angel, and then as he's passing him, he just slits his throat. So that's when Pike gets his shotgun, blows the general away, and then all hell breaks loose. And let me tell you, this is madness. You thought the first scene was madness. This is something that I don't think anyone had ever seen before at this up to this point. They get up on this basically, which is almost like a stage. It's like on the porch, and they just start blasting everyone away. You've got just waves of Mexican soldiers coming at them from all places, and they're getting shot, they're shooting them. And then my favorite is they get the machine gun, and that to me too is kind of like an extra FU to modernity, is because they're going to use this new technology to fight against the concept of that new technology. They said, "You like your modernity? Here's your modernity." Bah, 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 bah. And that is where Warren Oates has his best scene, where he gets on the machine gun and he starts blasting people. And it's like a long scene, and there's so many people dying. It is just one of the most well choreographed, most special action sequences I've ever seen. And I'm telling you, I got to be honest, I was hooping and hollering during it, because I was just like, I knew that this movie was famous for this kind of stuff. And I knew that there had to be some big stand, but I still, like, even with such high expectations, I was blown away. I was getting everything I was looking for and more. It was insane. And everybody's having their death scenes, and everyone, and Pike, of course, is going down to the last. And when Pike's getting shot, Dutch is like, "No, Pike." And it's everything all at once. It is incredible. And there's so much that goes into that scene as well. It's 5 minutes of just pure chaos and pure action and pure carnage, truly. And so I actually looked up an article that talks a lot about just that scene. And I wanted to this is a good explanation, or a good reason to talk about the movie itself as well, because kind of from the director's point of view, from cinema's point of view, from the people at the time, how it was received. And this article, which is by Tim Pelan from Cinephilia and Beyond, the website. And basically, I have a few quotes here. So this is from Sam Peckinpah himself, the director. And he says, "We wanted to show violence in real terms. Dying is not fun and games. Movies make it look so detached. With the Wild Bunch, people get involved whether they like it or not. They do not have the mild reactions to it. When we were actually shooting, we were all repulsed at times. There were nights when we'd finish shooting and I'd say, my God, my God. But I would always be back in the morning because I sincerely believe we were achieving something. To tell you the truth, I really can't stand to see the film myself anymore. It is too much of an emotional thing. I saw it last night, but I do not want to see it again for perhaps 5 years. So it is a harrowing film. I guess for people at the time, I feel kind of bad because I'm watching it as pure entertainment. I think it's fascinating. As someone who loves action, I'm an action lover. As much as I like doing some of our small movies that we do, I like horror movies and I love the practical effects. I love the craft of action. I love the craft of horror. That is why I like it. And so it's entertaining to me to just I guess it's kind of just a cacophony of different things. You've got the actual adrenaline pumping action that does have a reaction to people. It makes people excited, right? I mean, there's just a crazy scene. There's a lot going on, as we'll get into. But also it's all the things that I know have to go into making that scene possible. So the choreography of it, the like I said, the craft of it is just so impressive that I'm entertained more than I'm shocked. And of course, I'm living in 2025. I mean, we've been so desensitized to action. This is coming from a director who made this movie in 1969 when this kind of violence was a very big choice. This was an innovative choice. This was a new thing. And so of course he's going to be affected by it more than say audiences of today or creators of today. But that doesn't mean that it isn't true. That is what this movie is doing. It's showing people that in these Wild West spaghetti westerns that you watch when they're shooting each other, this is really what it looks like. It's not just them going, oh, and then falling over. It's actually them being torn apart. It's them having blood everywhere. It's a bloodbath. I mean, and that's what the violence of the Wild West was back in the day. So it is realistic. And that's, I think, what Sam's trying to do. And then there's also, it was kind of people, because it was so violent, there's a lot of pushback on the movie. And at the time, it wasn't as highly regarded. There were people that did like it, of course. Some people called it a masterpiece, but there were lots of people who thought it was just shock value for shock value's sake, which I can see why people would say that. I mean, there's definitely been movies over the years, even in my lifetime, that kind of have that distinction. And I could see why people at the time would maybe think that. But William Holden actually had a great quote in this article by Tim Pelan, kind of pushing back against that. And he says, in the article, it says, Holden was irritated with the line of questioning. He said, I just can't get over the reaction here. Are people surprised that violence really exists in the world? Just turn on your TV set at any night. The viewer sees the Vietnam War, cities burning, campus riots. He sees plenty of violence. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing here, right? This is happening 1969. We're in the middle of the Vietnam War. When this is that's one of the things about that war that was so different than wars past, is that people are seeing on the evening news carnage in real time. I mean, these are reporters that are out on the field, and you're seeing soldiers wounded, you're seeing people dying. I mean, this is carnage in real life. And so I guess Holden's pushback is, you're so appalled by this, and yet this is fiction, and you're letting the real thing just happen in Vietnam, which I think is a fascinating take on fictional violence versus real violence. But regardless, it gives you a lot to chew on. So let's go back to the Bloody Porch, the Battle of Bloody Porch, because I think that is kind of the main thing here. But I just thought this article did a really good job at kind of contextualizing this movie and kind of showing what their intention was behind it, and also while showing this next snippet that I'm going to show is very exemplifies just how much went into this movie, and specifically just this scene, as I mentioned earlier. So this is a long quote. I'm just going to kind of paraphrase some of it. This whole climactic shootout, known as the Battle of Bloody Porch, took 12 days to film. It comprised 325 edits and around 5 minutes of screen time. Multiple cameras shot simultaneously at different speeds from 24 frames to a second to 120. The frames spliced together later to make it appear as if time itself is elastic. We're experiencing the curious sensation of being in the melee, where time can appear to speed up, coalesce into a diamond-sharp moment of clarity, or slow to a crawl while bullets fly and explosions shake the senses. Very true. If you see that scene, you will see that there is moments where things are just happening so fast, and then you have smaller moments where people are talking to each other or yelling at each other, and you see. I mean, that's how real combat can feel. I mean, it can feel like it's going as slow as possible, but as fast as possible at the same time. Moving on to the latter part here, 5 or 6 cameras side by side shooting the whole master shot with various lenses, but shooting the whole thing and moving the entire setup 5 feet and then shooting it all again and then moving it 5 feet and shooting it all again. All the blood hits on the wall had to be cleaned up every time. All those people who just ran in and got shot now are going to shoot it again, and they're going to get shot again. They've got to come back in clean clothes. I don't know. It was like 5 or 6 days this way. And then they say, okay, boys, turn it around. We're going back the other way. So like I said, it was almost a week, but actually if you read that, it seems like it's a 2-week shoot, right? Because you did that whole thing that he just talked about, but then you're doing it again the other way because you have to get multiple cameras. You got to get multiple angles. So you're shooting this same scene, this 5-minute scene. You're shooting it countless amounts of time in countless amounts of ways. And then you're editing all that together. So this is like not just a marvel of cinematography. It's a marvel of editing. It's a marvel of just like organization. Like whose brain can get around trying to organize and make all that make sense. Like this entire scene with so much editing. Of course, cinematographers today, they know that too. They all filmmakers can understand how complex action sequences can be very difficult to splice together. But especially with this kind of analog system they had back in the day, you really had to just do it and do it in a way that was just very practical and very bare bones. You just had to put it all together and make it make sense. And honestly, I'm just so impressed by it. So that's really all I have time for. Once again, we ran long. This movie is just too big. It's too influential. It's too loaded. There's too many things to talk about for me not to kind of go over here, especially with these incredible scenes and that last scene in particular. So this movie is kind of like been retroactively very special to me because I knew that my cousin was in it. And then, of course, like, it's just so famous. I learned about it in film school. And so it's been a long time coming. So this is one of those movies where I was kind of worried that I wasn't going to like it. And to be fair, in those low points, it can be kind of boring. You can be kind of whatever. It definitely is peaks and valleys. To be completely honest, it's peaks and valleys. You're not going to enjoy every second of this. Maybe you are. I mean, that's part of what a Western is. It's just to kind of sit with it sometimes. They're slower. But when it hits, this movie hits. And so 8 out of 10 is more than fair. I can honestly see why someone would say higher. But I think for me, that 8 out of 10 is coming from those 3 big scenes. And the rest of it is probably anywhere from 5 to 7. So I think altogether, 8 out of 10 is pretty good. And when you look at the user score on IMDb, 7.9, once again, I feel like I'm pretty much right on the money when it comes to the normal audience. So if you like action, if you like Westerns, if you like seeing cinema history being made on screen, this is the movie for you. So I hope you guys have a great week this week. Next week, we're going to be doing a movie called Massacre Time by our old favorite Italian director, Lucia Fulci. This will be my second Fulci film. And this is like, during the 60s. So what's interesting about this next film is that it's about 3 years earlier than this movie. So my curiosity here is how much blood. This movie is supposed to be known for being really bloody, being really violent at least. And so I want to see, are they using squibs? Are they like, what are these violent scenes they're talking about? Like, is it going to be worse than the Wild Bunch? Am I going to have to retract some of the things I'm saying about this being so precedential in this movie? Is it really setting precedents, or were the Italian spaghetti Western directors like Sergio Leone and Lucia Fulci, were they doing this before Sam Peckinpah? That's what we'll find out. So if you are curious, check out the episode next week and we'll get into it. So I hope you guys have a great week this week, and I will see you next Friday.